the brain and the coconut. Drops of MCT. Wakey up the neurons from their Alzheimer's sleep. Today's guest is Dr. Mary Newport, physician, author, and Alzheimer's expert. Here to teach us how coconut oil, MCT oil, the ketogenic diet, and other nutritional and lifestyle strategies can help us prevent, slow down, and live well with Alzheimer's. The following is a story and lessons of Dr. Mary Newport. Today, I'd like to talk about nutritional approaches to treating or curing Alzheimer's. Can you talk about the story of your husband, Steve?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Mary Newport, and I'm a physician. I did newborn intensive care for 30 years in the Tampa Bay area of Florida, and my husband was an accountant, which was very convenient because he could work from my practice and he could work from home. I was hospital-based. I didn't have an office, so he could do all of his work as a manager and accountant from home, where he was able to take care of our children, which was awesome, for our family because I had a lot of emergencies and he could always be there for them. So when Steve was, he was like a very creative guy, very physically active. He loved to kayak. He was always out working in the yard and reading and all of that. So not somebody you would expect to get Alzheimer's. But when he was 51 years old, I started noticing some kind of strange problems. He was having more difficulty with his work, procrastinating a lot. And then he started forgetting appointments with our children. And then it became real obvious when he would forget if he'd been to the bank and the post office, which he did every day. And he'd misplace mail. And he couldn't remember if he had been to the post office or not. It was becoming a real problem. So we went to see, he was also depressed. And we saw a neuropsychiatrist who mentioned dementia, but he said more likely the depression was kind of affecting his memory. However, things kept getting much worse. And over the next few years, he gradually lost all of his ability to do any accounting. He'd been on a computer like all day, every day, working or playing on it. And he couldn't even remember, like a few years later, how to even turn it on, much less use a mouse or do anything on it or doing any accounting work. And so he was officially diagnosed in 2004 with early onset Alzheimer's disease. At that point, he was only 54 years old, which is very young. And I, as a physician, I took care of newborns, so I wasn't really aware that people could develop dementia so early. We used to think of it as senile dementia. When people became elderly, they would be in their second childhood, so to speak. But here he was having this problem much earlier. And in 2006, he was declining very rapidly. He had lost a lot of weight. He wasn't eating well. He could hardly finish a sentence. He walked very slowly. He had kind of a stiff, weird gait. He had tremors in his jaw when he would talk and in his hands when he was trying to eat. And the memory problems were becoming very serious. He just couldn't, he was so distracted. He couldn't keep track of what he was doing. And, for example, if he tried to cut the grass, he would start taking the lawnmower apart and take out the carburetor and do all kinds of strange stuff to it instead of cutting the grass with it. And all kinds of strange things were happening, So I was always looking at the Alzheimer's research. We were hoping for a cure. We were told, like, by the Alzheimer's Association that we were within 5 years of a cure. We heard that every year, year after year, we're within 5 years of a cure, donate, And finally, we had like 2 clinical trials that became available in our area after not having any for years. And he was set up to try out for 2 clinical trials 2 days in a row. And that was very fortunate because of what happened. But the night before, I was kind of looking online about the risks and benefits of the 2 drugs. Conceivably, he could have been accepted into both clinical trials, but we would have to pick one of them. So I was kind of trying to get more information about these medications and possible side effects. And I came upon a press release about a medical food that was in development. They had been doing some clinical trials. They were about a year away from coming out on the market, but they had published 2 trials. One was a pilot study. It was called AC1202, the product. They didn't really reveal much about what it was or what it did, but they had done a study in which people took a single dose on one day and they had a placebo on another day. And the people that took this had improved, like half of them, 9 out of 20, had improved memory and cognition on testing after they took this product compared to the day that they got the placebo. And then they had done a longer study with 152 people, and they got very similar results. They tested them over like 45 days and at 90 days, and some stayed in for 6 months. And they found that almost half of the people had improved cognitive testing scores, improved memory. And that was profound to me because none of the drugs that had been approved for Alzheimer's had ever been able to claim that they actually improved memory or cognition. The best they could claim was that they would slow the progress of the disease. And that's even the drugs that Steve was trying out for. That's what they believed, that it would slow the decline, not necessarily improve the person's symptoms. So I found their patent application because I was very curious about what this was. And it turned out it was something that was available that I could actually get. And it was MCT oil. That was the only active ingredient in it. And I think a lot of people now are becoming more and more familiar with MCT oil. I knew about it because in the 1980s, early 1980s, when I was doing my fellowship in newborn intensive care, we used to add it to the feedings of our preemies, our tiniest ones, the babies that were under 2 pounds birth weight. And we would add a little bit to each feeding, and they absorbed it very well, and they would grow faster. They would get home faster. And so I knew what it was, and I thought, well, this might be something I can get. But I hadn't ever seen it, in a store. I thought it might, I didn't know it was available. And I read in the patent application that it was extracted from coconut oil. Well, I knew I had seen coconut oil in health food stores. So I thought, okay, I might be able to do something with that if I can't get MCT oil. And so Steve went for the screening the following morning. So this is like about 1 a.m. I'm learning about all this. The reason why it could benefit somebody with Alzheimer's, I also learned from this patent application that the term type 3 diabetes was coined in 2005. So we're talking 2008 is when all this is happening with the coconut oil. In 2005, this group at Brown University had studied brains of people that had died with Alzheimer's. And these people did not have type 1 or type 2 diabetes, but they found that they had insulin resistance in the brain and insulin deficiency, which insulin resistance is like type 2 diabetes. Insulin deficiency is more like type 1 diabetes. It's kind of a combination. And then they coined the term type 3 diabetes to indicate Alzheimer's. And there are scans, they're called FDG PET scans, but they basically are glucose uptake scans. And they've known since the 1980s that there's decreased glucose uptake into the brain in areas that are affected by Alzheimer's. And, for people that don't know, all of our cells need fuel. And if you're eating a typical high carbohydrate diet, that fuel is going to be glucose predominantly. And what I learned from the patent application was the idea of using an alternative fuel. In this case, it was ketones. And it's known since like the 1960s that when we are fasting or starving, we deplete the stores of glucose in our liver and muscle pretty quickly within like 24 to 48 hours. And as you keep fasting, you start breaking down fat, and then fatty acids become the predominant fuel for organs like the heart and the kidneys and muscles. But it doesn't cross very well. These fatty acids don't cross very well into the brain. So some of the fatty acids are converted in the liver to ketones, which are much tinier particles, smaller than glucose particles, and they're avidly taken up by the brain, and brain cells can instantly switch over from using glucose to ketones. They basically feed the same biochemical set of reactions that end up with the energy molecule ATP, which the cells need to carry out all of their functions. So basically, this idea was to replace, since glucose couldn't get into cells because of insulin resistance, ketones don't require insulin, and that potentially they could provide alternative fuel to somebody with Alzheimer's. So the interesting thing about MCT oil is that no matter what you eat, even if you eat a high carbohydrate lunch, for example, if you take MCT oil, your liver will convert part of it to ketones. So this was really a brilliant idea. It came along in 2000, and then Dr. Samuel Henderson, came up with this idea based on work that Dr. Richard Veach at the NIH had done, showing that ketones were neuroprotective. And he was developing this medical food. They had their first pilot study come out in 2004, which was the year my husband was diagnosed. I wish I had learned about it 4 years sooner. And now we're in 2008, and it's still not out on the market yet, but it's about a year away. So anyway, I learned about all of this, and it's about 1 a.m. And around 9 a.m., he had his first screening for the clinical trial. And he had to get at least 16 points on a test called the mini mental status exam. And he got only 14 points, needed 16. And we were bitterly disappointed. We'd been waiting for years for a clinical trial to come along. We felt like these were our last hopes, that he would get into a clinical trial. And the doctor had him draw a clock. And I can show you what he drew. Can you see it there? That is a clock. What my husband drew as a clock. And you can see it's just a few little random circles and a few numbers, not organized at all like a clock, very disorganized. And the doctor told me that he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's, which I already knew, but that really hit home to see that drawing. And so on the way home, I thought, what do we have to lose? We stopped at a health food store and got some coconut oil. And then when we got home, I found the fatty acid composition from the USDA of coconut oil and refreshed my memory on which were the medium chain fatty acids in coconut oil. And I learned that it was about 60% medium chain fatty acids. One of those fatty acids was the one that was used in this medical food, C8 it's called, or caprylic acid. So I figured that their medical food dose was 20 grams, which was about 4 level teaspoons. And that equated to 35 grams, which is about 7 level teaspoons of coconut oil, which is a lot, a little over 2 tablespoons. And the next day he was scheduled, this time in the afternoon, to have his testing. And so for breakfast, I gave him a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. I mixed it into oatmeal. And I had some myself at the same amount. I thought I'm not going to make him take anything I won't eat. And I just wanted to see how it went. So he was scheduled probably about 4 hours after he had breakfast, for the testing. And this time he gained 4 points. And we were in a different town, a different institution, different day of the week. And this time he remembered that it was spring. He knew the day of the week, which he hadn't known the day before. He knew what town we were in, which he didn't know the day before, and what floor we were on in the institution, which he couldn't remember the day before. So he gained 4 points and he qualified for the study. At the time, it's like, was this just really good luck? Or was it prayers? Was it, or was it really this? Did this really help him that much with just one dose? But they had a pilot study, one dose. These people had improved memory testing by 4 or 5 points on average. So I thought, well, we're going to keep this going. And so kind of every morning thereafter, I kept giving him the, little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. But one of the things I had read in the patent application was that the ketone levels, after you take this 20-gram dose of the MCT oil, peak at 90 minutes, but they're almost gone at 3 hours after you take it. And this was just a once a day dose of this. And I thought, the brain is highly active. It needs energy 24/7. It's very active even when we're sleeping. So I thought, why just one dose? And I thought, I'm just going to start giving him some with each meal, for lunch and dinner. Also got a bunch of cookbooks and recipes online and learn how to use coconut oil. It's very adaptable to many different kinds of foods. And so each day, like the day that he started the coconut oil, he told me that it felt like a light bulb came on in his brain. And he started, like usually in the morning, he had been very sluggish. He had that slow, weird gait. And he wasn't very talkative. And he started kind of bouncing down the hall. He was much more talkative. He started whistling and making jokes again. There were things like, he would get confused with what utensil he wanted out of the drawer. He would remember that. He could get water out of the dispenser in the refrigerator, which he hadn't been able to do. Couldn't tie his shoes. I mean, there were all kinds of things like that. And his tremors almost immediately went away. The jaw tremor completely went away. He had a tremor in his hand, like first thing in the morning, but after 20 or 30 minutes after he had the coconut oil, it would be gone. No tremor. And by about the fourth or fifth day, we kind of looked at each other and said, something has changed for the better here. This is really something. Seems to be happening. And he just kept improving. And 2 weeks, 14 days after starting the coconut oil, he drew this clock. And you can see it's a huge difference. Can you see it? Okay. It's a full circle. All the numbers are there. There's a couple extra numbers, whole bunch of lines that look like hands of the clock. And then at 37 days, he drew this. It was a little tidier, not quite so many lines. And I finally asked him, I said, do you have all those lines on the clock? And he said, well, he was trying to line up the numbers across from each other. He wanted it to look neat. So that's why he had done that, which was very interesting. And, he started recognizing family members by name, and he was much less depressed. He felt like there was hope for his future. At about 2 months, he could tie his shoes again. He was walking completely normally again and able to run again. And at about 3.5 months, we had, by that time, increased how much I had started adding MCT oil to the coconut oil and increased how much he was getting with each meal. And at about 3.5 months, after not reading for a year and a half, he announced one day that he could read again. And I asked him why he couldn't read. And he said, because the words, he described it as satellite breakup, that the words would kind of go into pixels and they'd shake around on the page, and that the shaking had stopped and now he could read, which was really quite profound. And months later, he could remember what he had read hours earlier. This was around 9 or 10 months. He would tell me, for example, had a doctor visit. He was sitting in the waiting room, and a few hours later, he told me that he had read an article about Albert Einstein in Scientific American, and he told me details about the story. That was profound because he couldn't even finish a sentence, before this happened, much less read or remember anything that he had read. So things continuously improved over about 9 or 10 months. And then he stabilized, and he actually got into both of the clinical trials. He tried again about 2 months after that first attempt. And this time his midi mental status score was up to 20. So it had gone from 14, 18, and now it was 20 about 2 months after starting the coconut oil. And he qualified, for the study. And well, we found out later that he was on the placebo, which turned out to be a good thing because it was a bad drug. It turned out they actually never put it on the market. And he unfortunately got it for about 6 weeks, but he was on placebo for the first 18 months. And during that time, he was tested every couple of months. And there was a test called the Alzheimer's disease assessment score, the cognitive portion of it, that he gained 6 points. He improved by 6 points on that test over a year. And there was a test called the Activities of Daily Living, a 78-point test that he gained 14 points on. So this is how well you're able to take care of yourself. So he improved dramatically over a year, while he was taking the coconut oil. And when we later learned that he was on the placebo, then I could, with some assurity, know that this was a response to these ketogenic oils, that he was getting, and not to this drug that, we were hopeful, would help him. But this particular drug, it turned out to accelerate Alzheimer's. And after the 18 months, my husband crossed over, we found out later, and he had some side effects. One of the weird ones was that his hair started growing out a different color. And that was a classic symptom of that drug. And he had like an abrasion on his shin that didn't heal for a month. And when he would nick himself shaving, it would bleed for 4 or 5 days. He wasn't on blood thinners. And he fainted. I mean, there were all kinds of strange symptoms, and I ended up pulling him out of the study. It was just too much, and then he had declined too. He developed a cold. He had an outbreak of herpes simplex on his lips, which is not good. Those nerves go to the brain. So I took him out of the study, and then we found out they stopped the study a few months after he exited from the study, and they told us that the drug, when they looked at the data, it had accelerated Alzheimer's. So the people that got it that first year had gotten much worse, and Steve had improved. And it was all directly related to the coconut oil.
What is it about the MCT oil and or the coconut oil that is helping with the Alzheimer's? What is it about it?
So MCT oil, it's two fatty acids that are in coconut oil, but there are a lot of other fatty acids in coconut oil. And for example, a lot has been learned about these fatty acids since 2008. And for example, the MCTs, the standard product that's out there is called C8 and C10, two of the fatty acids. The one that was in the medical food is C8, and it's possible just to get C8 over the counter, from Amazon or in health food stores. And these two fatty acids are actually also alternative fuels for the brain. They cross the blood-brain barrier. They're taken up in astrocytes, which are cells that nourish the neurons. And so they also feed directly into that same pathway as ketones and glucose to make ATP, which is pretty cool. And then this one fatty acid called C10 has also been shown to have anticonvulsant activity, which is pretty interesting. The ketogenic diet has been used for over 100 years to treat people with drug-resistant epilepsy. So many people who are on a ketogenic diet with epilepsy also include coconut and MCT oil. And the C10, medium-chain fatty acid, has anticonvulsant activity. There's actually a product that was developed in the UK as anticonvulsant for people with epilepsy. And C12 is half of the coconut oil. It's not very much in the standard MCTs. There are a couple of high lauric acid MCTs out on the market, just readily available, but usually it doesn't contain much lauric acid. And lauric acid is half of coconut oil, called C12. And it has a couple of really interesting things about it. There's one study that was done by a company in Japan. They were very interested in trying to understand how coconut oil could help somebody like my husband so much, who had Alzheimer's. And they did cell cultures with astrocytes, and they found that lauric acid potently stimulates ketone production in astrocytes. The one thing that hasn't been proven yet is that it crosses the blood-brain barrier and that it does this in living creatures. So I've been trying to get investigators interested in doing that particular study. It's likely that it does. There's another fat called C14, which is longer, that is known to cross the blood-brain barrier. It just hasn't been studied yet. And then another interesting thing about lauric acid is that it's highly antimicrobial. It kills many different types of organisms. And we're talking about viruses like herpes simplex viruses, the viruses in the herpes family. Any virus that has a lipid coat on it, it dissolves the lipid coat and it inactivates the virus. It kills many types of bacteria. It kills protozoa. It kills spirochetes, like Lyme disease is one that comes to mind. There are spirochetes that cause dental decay that have been implicated in Alzheimer's, and it kills that, and kills Candida fungus. And you see products like wipes and sprays that say they kill 99.9% of organisms. They contain lauric acid, which is quite interesting. The people that, produce coconut oil, they can divide it into all the different fatty acids, and they can be used for any number of different things. And lauric acid is used for its antimicrobial properties, which is quite interesting. And there have been hundreds of studies now that have implicated different microorganisms like the ones we were talking about as possible triggers or causes of Alzheimer's disease or contributors to Alzheimer's disease. and lauric acid kills them. And I think that that was a big factor in my husband's continued improvement. I mentioned that, when he was taking that drug, he had broken out. He had had a cold and he broke out with fever blisters on his mouth. And this was something that happened to him repeatedly his whole adult life, where he would have a fever blister every 2 or 3 weeks and it would hang around for a week and then it would slowly go away. When we started the coconut oil, we rarely ever saw a fever blister again, which was really incredible, except this time when he had a cold when he was on that drug. And one of the interesting thing, the drug that he was on was supposed to remove plaques from the brain. There's these what they call plaques and tangles in the brain, and it was supposed to remove plaques. Well, and in 2010, it was discovered that the plaques are antimicrobial. They find all kinds of organisms inside of these plaques in the brain. So it seems that it is part of the immune system's effort to try to combat infections in the brain, and that these infections may be more prevalent in somebody that has Alzheimer's disease. And then they have problems with clearing the plaques out of the brain. Most people, you form plaques in your brain, and there's a turnover. Your brain is capable of dissolving and removing them from the brain, but people with Alzheimer's have a problem doing that. So lauric acid is really an interesting substance. And so that's one reason why I was really glad that I didn't abandon coconut oil and use only MCT oil. The lauric acid was really important. And coconut oil also has a lot of what are called polyphenols. They're also in olive oil, and they're anti-inflammatory, they're antioxidants, and inflammation in the brain is a big component of the disease. You don't have Alzheimer's without inflammation in the brain. So there are a number of different things about coconut oil and its medium chain fatty acids, that could help somebody with Alzheimer's.
Okay, so you've mentioned a few potential causes of Alzheimer's that MCT oil and coconut oil are maybe helping address. Things like the microbes, glucose uptake into the brain, and then inflammation. Yeah, well, what has all this taught you about the causes of Alzheimer's? I know we can't say for sure, but yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, the official word out there is we don't know the cause. I mean, that's the Alzheimer's Association's position. I've gone to their meetings every year for over 10 years. And only one time did they ever have a session on infections. There was one 2-hour session one time. And they're really focused on removing the plaques and tangles, that the plaques and tangles are the cause of the disease. And, Dr. Richard Veach, the ketone expert, we talked about this many times, and other researchers feel that these are downstream effects of the problem, that it's a fundamental metabolic problem. If you think about it, every cell to carry out its activities, it needs fuel, and it needs to produce energy to do so. If you have areas of your brain that don't accept fuel and aren't producing energy, everything that happens in that cell is slowing down, maybe coming to a grinding halt. It's like a factory. You pull the plug, the power goes out, nothing's going to get assembled in a factory. And there are these little tiny organelles called mitochondria, and neurons can have 1,000 or so mitochondria in them. Neurons they can live 120 years, our whole lifespan. And they have, long extensions, and all throughout the extensions are mitochondria, that keep that cell going. And if you're not feeding the mitochondria with fuel, they're not going to produce energy. The other thing mitochondria do, they make thousands of proteins. Like every cell needs very specific proteins to operate. And, if the factory doesn't have fuel, it's not going to be putting out these proteins that the cells need. So infections seem to be a really important component of Alzheimer's disease. There are microorganisms in the brain, and much more so as we get older. It's just the ability to fight them becomes less and less. The immune system weakens as a person gets older. And then there are lifestyle choices that people make. There's a commission. It's a commission of experts for the Lancet, which is one of the prestigious medical journals, and they've been putting out reports every couple of years. And the most recent report in 2024, they said that 50% of cases of dementia, of which Alzheimer's is the most common, 50% of them might be preventable by making healthy lifestyle choices, which is pretty profound. And it makes you realize that nutrition does have something to do with Alzheimer's. They say that diet, a healthy diet, is at the top of the list. Getting physical activity and mental activity, keeping your brain mentally active are very important. And then other things like avoiding diabetes or controlling it, controlling blood sugar if you have diabetes, controlling blood pressure is very important. People that have high blood pressure that's out of control, much more likely to have mini strokes and other problems that can cause dementia. Head injuries. So activities where you're likely to get a head injury puts you at risk. And then getting adequate sleep. Some people will sleep 4 or 5 hours a night, night after night after night. That's not healthy. And, they basically recommend getting somewhere between 7 and 8 hours of sleep at night, but not too much sleep. That can also be detrimental. If a person has sleep apnea, which is very common. So this is where a person, sometimes they'll stop breathing. They just stop breathing, but it's more often that they have some kind of obstruction to their breathing. And as we age, the tissues kind of sag. They get softer. People who are heavier are prone to this too, but it can affect thin people as well. But basically, there's a blockage. They'll snore. The tongue will fall back in the throat, for example, and kind of block the airway. And a person will look like they're struggling to breathe. The air just isn't getting into their lungs, and the oxygen level can drop down quite a lot. And this can happen repeatedly, like dozens and dozens of times during the night when you're sleeping. So if somebody snores or they just don't feel good, they don't feel like they got enough rest, even though they were in bed for 7 hours, it could be that they have sleep apnea. So getting that evaluated and treated is very important. It's one of the known causes of dementia. And then there are things like correcting hearing and vision. A lot of people at first, they for a while they believe that the people who don't hear well, some people have very, very poor hearing, that they seem confused because they simply aren't hearing, what the other person is saying, so they may look like they have dementia, but they think it actually may contribute to dementia as well now. Correcting vision is very important. So, there are a number of things that people can do. Well, smoking is obvious, should be obvious. And alcohol consumption too can affect brain cells. It can actually damage brain cells. So there are many things that people can do to try to avoid dementia. And this commission, they say the evidence supports that 50% of dementias are preventable, and that includes Alzheimer's type dementia. So a lot of the things, the changes that we see in the Alzheimer brain are actually there in the aging brain. It's just much more exaggerated in Alzheimer's. So, there are many things that people can do to try to avoid dementia as they get older.
This is interesting because I've talked to other people about, say, bipolar disorder or depression or some of these other, mental health challenges, and it seems to be the exact same, well, very similar answer as to what you're saying. So,
I mean, my husband, one of his earliest symptoms was depression. And he also developed anxiety and, psychiatric symptoms are a strong component of Alzheimer's disease. They develop behavioral problems, agitation, delusions. They have false beliefs, hallucinations, and just complete, personality changes. There's just a lot of overlap between Alzheimer's and, some psychiatric illnesses. And when, when my husband improved so much, I started trying to get this information out. I wrote an article that got out on the internet. And then there was a news article in our local newspaper, the St. Petersburg Times, and it went viral. It was kind of crazy. So many people are worried about Alzheimer's. I mean, almost everybody knows they either have a relative, at least one relative, or friends, who are dealing with this problem. So then, people started writing back to me, and some of the people that tried coconut oil, for example, there was a young lady, she was in her 20s with severe bipolar disorder. She couldn't work. She really couldn't function. She improved with just taking coconut oil and was able to go back to work, and she just felt better. And, other people with stories like that. I have another family member. There are these other ketone products out now. The ketone ester that I talked about that Dr. Veach developed, and my husband got to take it. He was the first person with Alzheimer's that got to take it as a pilot study. This was after he was exposed to that clinical trial drug. He had a big setback, and Dr. Veach said, "Why don't we do a pilot study and give him the ketone ester?" And he came back from that. All of everything reversed. All of the new problems that he had got better, and he was stable, for quite a long time after that. But so now the ketone ester has been out on the market since 2018 in the US. Ketone salts have been out since 2016, and many people have reported with depression or anxiety that it improves those symptoms. It's really quite interesting. And there's a whole movement now, the metabolic psychiatry group, the Bazuki Foundation, that are funding studies of ketogenic diet and mental health issues. So there have been people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and major depression, anxiety that have markedly improved, gotten off a ton of the psychiatric medications that they were on, by going on a ketogenic diet. So they're funding studies along those lines. It's really all quite interesting. It's just a fundamental fuel. Ketones are a fundamental fuel. Insulin resistance is a very big problem in general. And so, there's much that we can do to try to avoid getting Alzheimer's disease and age gracefully.
You mentioned the ketogenic diet, and we've talked about MCT oil and coconut oil, which are, I guess, can be part of that. My question is, what are some other foods or nutritional approaches we can take to also help with Alzheimer's? I mean, I guess we could just think of the ketogenic diet, but I'll let you get into it.
Yeah, so my favorite is called the Mediterranean style ketogenic diet. So back in 2006, 2 years before my husband started the coconut oil, we had switched from what I call the convenience fast food diet to a Mediterranean diet. I had read that people with Alzheimer's who ate the most Mediterranean-like diet, which are whole foods basically, lived on average 4 years longer than people that ate the least Mediterranean-like diet, and that was the first time it ever occurred to me that nutrition had anything to do with Alzheimer's. So we had started that, and we had added omega-3 fatty acids, DHA, to what we were doing, but he still had continued to progress. I improved a lot. I ended up losing a lot of weight. I felt much healthier. I wasn't craving. I mean, we had already reduced the carbohydrates because you eat whole grains, and you don't eat as much carbohydrate on a Mediterranean diet, just kind of basically speaking, compared to, people who aren't at it. And losing the fear of fat. We've been taught for a long time to eat a low fat diet. Well, it turns out that that's a bad idea because you have to make up the calories somehow, and it's going to be carbohydrates that you're going to make up the calories that you need to maintain your weight. So the Mediterranean diet is really awesome because, if you stick with the whole foods, there are lots of, I found out I actually liked vegetables when we did that. Had eaten, kind of canned vegetables before that. I started eating fresh vegetables. I got really interested in cooking. We were eating more salmon and fish and still eating, some meat and that type of thing, but whole fat dairy, whole milk tastes so much better than skim milk and, full fat cheeses and yogurts and all of that. And so it was pretty easy to turn that into a ketogenic diet. And kind of by default, once we started adding the fat to Steve's diet, he started gaining a few pounds and we weren't subtracting anything. So if you add calories to your diet, you're probably going to gain weight. And so he just had naturally anyway started eating much less fruit. I mean, he kind of continued eating berries and things like that, but he ate much less fruit. He started leaving the bread. He wasn't eating as much pasta. We weren't eating even white rice. And then we were just eating small amounts of whole grain rice. And, by virtue of increasing the fat and greatly reducing the carbohydrates, Steve was effectively on a ketogenic diet. So I think that the diet itself also contributed, and then including MCT and coconut oil kind of helps maintain a level of ketosis. You'll always be in mild ketosis if you do that. Even if you eat some carbohydrates, you're going to be producing some ketones, which is really cool. So I strongly advise people, I talk to a whole lot of people. I communicate with a lot of people and I write books about all of this too. And, to try to reduce the carbohydrate portions that they're eating. You may not have to completely get rid of it. I mean, some people just can't imagine a life without bread. For example, a lot of people say that I just couldn't possibly give up bread. Well, you don't have to completely give it up, but what I suggest is cutting out sugary beverages. Those are a big source of inflammation in the brain. A lot of them contain high fructose corn syrup, which is inflammatory to every tissue, including the brain. And so getting rid of that, getting rid of obvious sweets, maybe save them for a treat here and there. I mean, at Christmas, people are bound to, you're going to go places where you might want to have a little bit of something, but in general, just try not to eat, like sweets, obvious sweets on a regular basis. Try to reduce or cut out starchy vegetables. And, I suggest that people start by like cutting their portions in half, like their pasta. Some people will load up their plate, a big plate of pasta, cut it in half, and then, put more meat on the top of it. And then when you're used to that, cut it in half again, the portion. And there's an interesting study. It's going to be published soon. Dr. Stephen Cunnane in Canada has done a lot of work with ketones, ketone PET scans. It's very interesting work. But in an assisted living facility, they had elderly people, and what they did, they ate their usual breakfast, but then they cut their carbohydrate portions in half for lunch and for dinner. It reduced the sugar in their blood by 40%. And chronically high blood sugar is inflammatory. People that do that end up getting prediabetes and diabetes if they consistently are eating too much sugar and carbohydrates. People don't realize that white flour is almost pure sugar. White rice is almost pure sugar. People don't realize that. They don't taste sweet, but they are digested that way. So anything that you can do to kind of reduce the carbohydrate intake and increase the fat intake could be really healthier, for aging and for your brain. So I just happen to like the Mediterranean kind of diet. It's basically the basic food groups. It's, they call it the Mediterranean diet because they're kind of a larger number of centenarians. People lived over 100 years old in that part of the world. And when they look at what they eat, they eat more vegetables and fruits, and they eat fish, olive oil. It's actually a higher fat diet, but this can be adapted to any culture. There's vegetables, fruits, grains, meats, fish, eggs. I mean, those are available, in pretty much all cultures. It's just what we do with them, how we cook them that makes it different, culturally different. But pretty much any diet is adaptable just by basically eating more fats and eating less carbohydrates.
You alluded to the fact that even your cognition, mood, cravings, and other things improved following this ketogenic diet and, using coconut oil, MCT oil, etc. So it sounds like what you're saying is these approaches aren't only going to help people with or developing Alzheimer's or other dementias, but also just the everyday person. Anybody can, or most people can probably benefit from this.
Yeah. A lot of people say that they feel sharper, they have more energy, they sleep better. That type of thing I hear a lot. I used to was one of those people. I felt like I needed a nap every afternoon, but I never got to take one because of the kind of work that I was doing. But when I started taking MCT oil, that kind of went away. I never do feel like I need a nap in the afternoon. I just go all day long. And, I felt like it gave me more mental endurance. At that time when Steve started taking it, I did too. And I thought, if it could help somebody with Alzheimer's, it might be able to help prevent it. And I have a really strong family history on my mother's side, actually both sides of my family. There have been people with Alzheimer's, but it's especially strong on my mother's side. And, so I'm worried about it myself. And I thought, I'm going to take it too. When Steve started taking coconut oil and MCT oil, I did too, and I've kept it up ever since. I probably have 4 or 5 tablespoons a day of coconut oil and or MCT oil. And I eat a low carb diet. I've been eating a Mediterranean style diet since 2006, and I don't take prescription medications. My blood pressure is normal. I'm 73 years old, believe it or not. Yeah, well, I look that old, but anyway, um, compared to most people my age, I feel very healthy, no aches and pains. I sleep really well. And I wasn't sleeping well, before I started doing this. It really has made a big difference in my life. And then it was like the 3rd day is when I stopped craving carbs, where I just started eating all less of that junk food and convenience food that had the fructose and all of that in it, and abandoned the low fat diet. And it's really uncommon for me to ever have my stomach growl because I'm hungry. It's just, I'm very satisfied with what I eat, and I don't think about my next meal all the time like I used to before that. I eat a bowl of cereal and I wanted another bowl of cereal right away because it's just pure carbohydrate, basically.
Well, it's a lovely message and very useful information you've provided with us today. If people want to connect or learn more, you have some books, you have a website. Yeah, where can people go?
Yeah. So I have a website. It's coconutketones.com. It's COCONUTKETONES. There's no Y in ketones. And then, my books, I have 4 books, but I'll show you 2 of them. This one's the 3rd edition of my first book. The first book came out in 2011, and this is the 3rd edition that came out last fall. And, it's called Alzheimer's Disease: What If There Was a Cure? The Story of Ketones. And it tells my husband's story. About a third of the book tells his story, and there are a lot of tips for caregivers too, because you don't know what's ahead of you when you are taking care of somebody with dementia. And so I have a lot of, I think, useful information in there. And then this book, this was my pandemic project. When I realized it wasn't going to just be 3 or 4 weeks, I started writing. And this is called Clearly Keto for Healthy Brain Aging and Alzheimer's Prevention. And there's a really lengthy area on the Mediterranean diet and all about diabetes and avoiding all of that. It also goes into all of those lifestyle risk factors that we were talking about beyond the ketogenic diet. I provide like the evidence for doing all of this. And then the last chapter is about 80 pages long, and it took me 10 months to write. And it's about what goes wrong in the Alzheimer brain. I think I read 150 different scientific articles to just try to consolidate it. I think most physicians even could get something out of this, because it just isn't taught in a holistic way. What goes wrong in the Alzheimer brain? We know about plaques and tangles, you hear about inflammation, but, I really tried to put it all together. It helped me understand too the process going on as I was writing it. So, it was going to be the first chapter, but I thought most people would not even get through the first chapter. They would never get to the rest of the book. So I made it the last chapter in the book. But anyway, so I have a couple other books. One of them's called, I wrote it in 2015. It's a much shorter, it's the shortest book. It's called The Coconut Oil and Low Carb Solution for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Other Diseases. And that one kind of gets more quickly into the diet and how to use coconut and MCT oil. And then I have another book called The Complete Book of Ketones, a practical guide to ketogenic diets and ketone supplements. And I got to interview 16 different ketone researchers, including several that have passed away now, that were researching ketones in the 1960s. Dr. Richard Beach, Dr. George Cahill, who discovered that ketones fuel the brain during starvation in the 1960s. Dr. Theodore Van Italy was 99 when he wrote the foreword to my book, and he and his associates had discovered that MCTs produce ketones in the liver when you consume MCT oil. So my own journey has just really been extraordinary. The people that I've gotten to meet who are involved in all of this, and I'm just really grateful to all of them for everything that they taught me. My husband gained almost 4 extra better years because of it. He did lose his battle with Alzheimer's. He had about 4 years after we started the coconut oil. He was standing, he had given me a hug and told me he loved me, and I went to work, and the lady that was taking care of him called me a few minutes later, and he had fallen straight back. He hit his head. He went into a seizure, a very long seizure, and had stopped breathing. He became completely dependent after that. But, I always look at, it was an extra 4 years that were better quality than the year before he started the coconut oil. And, when somebody has cancer and they get 4 extra years, that's a big deal. Well, with Alzheimer's, it is too. And he was really quite functional, and he always knew who I was, and I miss him. But anyway, really appreciate you have invited me on to help spread the message, and maybe we can do this again sometime. I could talk for 2 more hours.
Oh, I would love that. I really appreciate you coming on too, and your kindness and your wisdom, and I really value this time we had together today. And I hope I definitely want to do it again. We could do it for 2 hours or 3 hours or any number of hours. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome, Michael. I really appreciate it, and thank you for helping me spread the message, Michael.